I'm Ace Smith, author of Pitcher and the Dictator, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. You are watching Stranger Than Fiction, our non-fiction show here on Author's Voice. I am your host, Bjorn Skaptason, and I come to you today sending out greetings to my old ancestral homeland of Kansas City. We're not going to talk about Kansas City much today, but we are going to talk about one of Kansas City's favorite sons, or grandfathers, I suppose, because our topic landed in Kansas City later in life. Anyway, today we are talking about The Pitcher and the Dictator. It comes to us from University of Nebraska Press. The cost is $26.95. Thank you, University of Nebraska Press, for publishing this and helping our author get here. Our author is Ace Smith. Welcome to the show, Ace.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a minute to tell the world
Sure.
a little bit about who you are, and I'm also going to get out of this hat. Somebody who was once president once said, never put anything on your head. So now I can't run for president. Averell Ace Smith is a political consultant and a lifelong baseball fanatic. He's a veteran of many political campaigns. He's on the state and the national level, including all of the campaigns of California Senator Kamala Harris, and we might talk about that a little bit later. But this is his first book, and it is a book about your lifelong passion. Before I jump right in, I want to quote what Tom Hoffroth said a few months ago in The Drill, something very nice. The story is beyond compelling. He's talking about The Pitcher and the Dictator. The story is beyond compelling. A world lesson on what happened in the Dominican when a tyrant named Rafael Trujillo took over, rigged the election of 1930 by having his people kill off opponents, then decided a winning baseball team with his name splashed across the chest would convince the locals that through victory on the field, he should get reelected. Ace, welcome to Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and Author's Voice. What on earth brought you to this book?
Thank you. The book kind of brought me to it.
Okay.
I'm not one of these people who ever woke up with a desire to write a book. And I had this very interesting thing happen to me. It was in the summer of 2005. Mm-hmm. And I'm a huge reader. And that summer I was actually goofing off because I just run this really tough campaign. And I'm just down the street from this bookstore in North Beach, very famous bookstore called City Lights Books. Mm-hmm. And I would wander down there every week and buy a couple books and read them. And one of the books I read was
You're in San Francisco.
In San Francisco. One of the great books I read was a book called The Feast of the Goat by Vargas Llosa. That book talks about Trujillo and opens your eyes and tells the story essentially of his reign, but mainly about his assassination by the CIA in 1961. And then just by chance, I read this wonderful book called Satchel Page's America, which was written by a sports writer who was really at the end of his life. And he had done a series in newspapers on Page in the 1960s, and he kind of took all of his notes, and he essentially put them in some sort of order, but they're really unfiltered Satchel. And in this book, he told the story of the 1937 series. Satchel did, but only about a page or two. And I was riveted. I was fascinated. I wondered, is this really true? This really could have happened, and what's the deal? So I, being a born researcher, I looked up and I tried to figure out, okay, where are the primary sources? And it turned out the University of California in Santa Barbara had all the Dominican newspapers in the original language from 1937. So one weekend, just out of curiosity, I motored down the 101, about 350 miles to Santa Barbara, read through them cover to cover, and I was just transfixed. Yeah. And I decided, not only does the story need to be told, but it's never been told in a way that was really true to what happened. And in the context, it had been kind of told in dribs and drabs by the American players, and they, honestly, they didn't really even understand what was going on.
Could you give us the elevator pitch?
Yeah,
book so that
sure.
folks at home can, because I think what we're going to do after this is kind of dive deep into this, at least three
Sure.
topics that this book, the whole thing could be
Yep.
about that.
Well, the elevator pitch is very simple. It's the year 1937. Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, is running for re-election, as much as dictators run for re-election. But he has decided that, and his hench people have taught, he didn't like baseball, his hench people had talked him into essentially creating a baseball series as essentially like say the modern equivalent of Roman games. Here's what we will give you in exchange for your liberty. So they cook up this championship series. And honestly, I put a picture of this in the book because I had everyone, no one would believe me that this was actually true. And so you'll see in the book, there's actually a picture here. And what it shows is that...
Of the team?
No, of the name of the series.
Name of the series.
Name the series literally Championship Dedicated to the Re-election of Rafael Trujillo. That's the name of the series. Okay, and the series gets underway. There's 3 teams. His team, playing out of what's today called Santo Domingo. He had renamed it at the time Ciudad Trujillo. Another team from San Pedro de Macorís, which actually is probably the place where a lot of the American players come from today, just down the coast, and Santiago on the north coast. 3 teams. What happens is they get this thing up and going, and all of his henchmen, of course, have told Trujillo, don't worry, we got it. They start playing the tournament, his team starts losing. So the poor man who is running the team wakes up one day and he decides that this is not just going to be bad on my resume, I'm going to get shot. So what they do is so the Trujillo people decide to send one of Trujillo's biggest, most loyal and dedicated followers and most effective, kind of hench people to America. And he's this little dentist, and his name was Dr. Jose Enrique Ibar. And he always wore a white linen suit, and kind of like Mark Twain, and a fedora that was white with a black band. And he was sent to America and to fix the team. And the way they were going to fix the team is they were going to recruit the best Negro League players. So what happens is he shows up completely unannounced on the streets of New Orleans, and he goes to meet Satchel Paige, and he says, Mr. Paige, my name is Dr. Jose Enrique Ibar. I represent President Trujillo and of the Dominican Republic, and he'd like to retain your services. And Satchel recalls, he says, my goodness, he's like, okay, I've seen a lot of things. He's like, this must be one sick ball club if they got a doctor in charge, That's what he's thinking. And then the other thing is like, okay, is this real? And so he probably, for the first time in the history of sports, he says to the little dentist, he says, show me the money. So the dentist comes back the next day with a bank ledger with Satchel Paige's name above the line and $30,000 underneath it, which in 1936 was a fortune. It was probably something like 5 times what Satchel had made his entire career before then. And so Satchel says, yeah, we're going to bring my catcher, we'll jump on a plane. So they get down there. That would be easy if they just got down there and everything worked out and they won and they left, but it wasn't so simple. Satchel then helps them recruit a bunch of other Negro League players, and they maybe have possibly one of the best baseball teams ever assembled in terms of pure talent when they're done. Little catch. They're a bunch of young African-American men, and they are in like one of the most repressive dictatorships in the world. Yet guess what? 1937, they actually have, in some senses, more freedom in this dictatorship than they do in the land of the free, home of the brave. Why? Because there's no signs on the windows saying no coloreds, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens? They have money in their pocket. So they start partying. And they party to the point where they start losing games. So how does the dictator and his people solve this?
The way they always do?
They literally take the head of his Gestapo and they install the man as assistant manager of the team. Forthwith, he goes out and threatens all the people running all the bars, dance halls. If you serve another drink to any of these players, you'll be shot. And he tells all the players essentially the same thing. And the thing winds up. But the book is not written as just about that particular series. The series is really just kind of like the lodestone for the bigger story of Satchel Paige's life. And so it's really a parallel lives of Satchel Paige and the dictator Trujillo, and I take you through using that as the focal point of the book, but take you through their entire lives.
Well, that's absolutely new. I haven't seen, obviously I've read a lot of parallel biographies, but coming across this story where we can genuinely, legitimately construct a parallel biography of a murderous dictator and one of the greatest, most beloved pitchers in baseball, that's just crazy.
And in some senses, there's some crazy parallels.
Uh-huh.
They both basically came from incredibly poor backgrounds. True, in different ways. I mean, Satchel is born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1906, in abject poverty. In a remarkable story. I mean, you hear about people overcoming obstacles. His is the most remarkable story you have ever heard. Trujillo grows up in the kind of the backward city of San Cristobal, which was pretty depressed because they had sugar plantations, but at that time it had really gone downhill and had moved out. And Trujillo had no really opportunity to climb the ladder of opportunity in his country, being essentially kind of a poor country boy. And then what happens is the Marines come in, and we don't read about this. I didn't read about this in my history books, I don't know about you. The Marines, U.S. invades the Dominican Republic in 1916. And we do it. Why do we do it? We do it because they owe a bunch of money to Wall Street. That's why we do it. So Marines come in. We dissolve their government. We censor the press. We have martial law. But one of the key things they needed to do was they needed to recruit native Dominicans to be part of their police force, so when they left, just as we do today. And Rafael Trujillo was the perfect person, and that was the only, the truth is, the world would have never heard, ever, of Rafael Trujillo if it's not for the Americans invading them. And so he essentially runs a coup d'etat and takes over the country and runs it. But in some senses, there's a real parallel. He has a different, obviously, trajectory, different set of obstacles, but it's very much, it's somewhat a parallel story to Satchel's.
Yeah, of course, Satchel.
With an evil turn.
With an evil turn.
Yes.
Satchel learned how to carry 16 satchels by rigging that pole, and that's a story everybody knows about if they know a little about Satchel Paige. And then Trujillo learned that by being a thug,
Exactly.
and then a thug for the occupiers, that might put you onto a position to get out of poverty and into
Exactly.
a larger role. So, so you've told us about how Trujillo managed to get in charge, but there's so much of that intervention hanging over this entire story. And of course, this is the story of 1937. The intervention is 1916.
16 to 24.
1916 to 24. But even then, and this is, again, with a story that's crazy anyway, it comes loaded up with the most over-the-top symbolism during every game at Trujillo Stadium in Trujillo City, just beyond right field, everybody can see what?
The USS Memphis.
The USS, an American cruiser sitting right there.
Yep. That had been wrecked in a tsunami and left there to rust. And it wasn't until Roosevelt's friendship towards Latin America policy that we actually even took it away. And a funny story about that. I had heard.
Folks at home can see it.
Yeah. Okay. I had heard from various folks that it was over the right field wall, but I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't prove it until I actually found I was digging around the Dominican archives, which was another story. It's just one of the most remarkable national archives I've ever been to. And I found periodicals that actually had cartoons of it, where they drew the battleship or the cruiser into the picture and was able to literally place it at the scene of the crime.
Okay.
For the book. Otherwise, I hadn't. I had some passing reference, but I actually, honestly, wasn't. I wasn't fully believed that I had enough proof to put it in the book until I had that.
So for all of the games played in this tournament or any other,
there is the cruiser over the right
cruiser,
field.
reminding both Satchel and African American players and everybody who's a Dominican, that there's always this other power in the hemisphere that could turn everything on its head whenever
Absolutely.
they decide to do it. So one of the players that I think is most fascinating in this, and it's enough that we have this tournament in the Dominican Republic where there are all these ringers from the U.S. playing from the Negro Leagues playing there. One of the things that gets in the way of both Trujillo's plans and the American players is they've never had to play against some of the Latin American players, very infrequently. And down from Cuba comes this fellow who may well be the greatest player of that generation, someone I've never heard of until I read your book.
Mm-hmm.
And he lands on another one of the teams, and suddenly, Satchel has somebody that he has a very tough time getting out compared to other local players. Tell us a little bit about
He does. Martin Diego.
Martin Diego, yeah.
And there's a good reason why you haven't heard about him, which was so, and let me start the story at the end and explain why you've never heard of him. Diego was a Cuban, and during the dictatorship of Batista in the 50s, he was so sickened by what was going on in his country that, like Pablo Casals leaving Spain, he left Cuba and played in Mexico, and he actually raised money for Fidel Castro with baseball tournaments in Mexico. He returned to Cuba as the Minister of Sports. And so, of course, for Americans and the American government, he was, of course, became a non-person at that point.
After 59.
So there's a reason why you would have never heard of him. But why was he such a great player? He was probably one of the only players who he could play every position except for catcher. Later in his career, he became a great pitcher. He had a rifle arm. He was quick. He could hit for average. He could hit for power. He was really maybe the best all-around player who ever played baseball, and he was a great leader to boot. And so his Santiago team that they had recruited was a truly difficult team to beat. The other thing to remember about this series is number of fathers of famous American players played in this series. Perucho Cepeda, who many said was a better player than Orlando, played in the series on Trujillo's team. Louis Tion's father, he was known as Sir Skinny, played on the Santiago team. And maybe two of the quickest players who ever played baseball played in this series. And one of them was St. Louis native, Cool Papa Bell, who was probably one of the swiftest center fielders who ever played, and a great Dominican named Titelo Vargas. Now, Titelo Vargas also played in the American Negro Leagues. He was not allowed to play in the regular leagues. He's so fast that at one point in the Midwest, when he was running around playing, they actually had a foot race between him and Jesse Owens, and he won. So that just tells you the level of talent in this series in general.
And even though you don't bring this into this book, it's something hanging over every baseball fan, the level of talent that is excluded from what is supposed to have been the elite talent pool of Major League Baseball at that time.
No question.
And you mentioned in the introduction that part of your love of baseball went from when you were a kid and you were looking at the baseball encyclopedia, and in there was 1,000 pages in one chapter on the Negro Leagues. And so I would think any American that's a ball fan would already know that there's this whole generation, many generations, of the finest players ever to play, such as Satchel Paige, quite possibly the greatest pitcher ever to play the game, and that we understand that these people were excluded unjustly from Major League Baseball. That doesn't even open the door on other markets that are now being exploited. So, if African Americans were excluded and weren't able to participate at the highest levels, neither were Caribbean players, Latin American players, or anything like that. And some of the greatest players, like Diego,
Yep.
played their entire careers without Americans ever even having a chance to see them.
As a matter of fact, one of my favorite stories in the book is there was a Cuban player, Silvio Garcia,
Okay.
who was a great, he played on one of the teams, he was a great pitcher and infielder who could hit for power. And Branch Rickey, who was the famous general manager of the Dodgers, who of course signed Jackie Robinson, he was kind of surveying around for people who could fill that place, so the first African-American player, and he was kind of doing interviews, and he interviews Silvio, who's Cuban, and he says, Silvio, I'd like to know, so if you're playing, the interview's going fine, and someone like hurls the N-word at you, like, what are you going to do? And Silvio looks at him with just casually. He said, oh, I would kill him. Of course,
The same
Silvio,
question he asked for Jackie Robinson. Yeah.
Of course, Silvio did not make the cut.
Indeed, he was never given a chance to make a cut on that. Yeah, what a remarkable story. Well, let's go back to Satchel Paige, because again, Trujillo is if he's the evil foil in this particular story, Satchel is, even in his day, he is an outsized character. Even excluded from Major League Baseball, he is an outsized character. What about Satchel is going to make so many of these Negro League players, Josh Gibson, follow him to Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, follow him in the middle of the season. Yep. They bolted on their American teams to go to the Caribbean to play in this, and they followed Satchel. So
they also followed the money.
They followed the money, of course. Well, what do you think is the weight of Satchel Paige among that cohort of people?
There's no question. He was the outstanding star, not just of the era, but probably of the century. I mean, I truly believe that if he had been able to play Major League Baseball, say like Babe Ruth was, we would utter his name in the same breath as Babe Ruth. But he wasn't able to play in the major leagues until he was 42. If he had played in the day of television, we would utter his name in the same breath as Muhammad Ali. Again, the tragedy of his life is that he was excluded from showing his talents off in the major leagues until he was 42 years old, and they still shine through in the most brilliant way. And he also, could you imagine him on television?
Right, like Ali, he's also an oversized
He's
character.
a flamboyant, he's a character, he's a... the thing to remember about Satchel Paige is how he was formed. And we hear a lot of the stories about athletes overcoming adversity, and usually it's a torn ACLU or ACL or other things like that. But, I mean, just look at his life. He's born in 1906 in Mobile, Alabama, a place where you're just as likely to, you're not just facing segregation, you're facing possible lynching. When he's 6 years old, his mother tells him, Leroy Page, she says, you have to go get a job, help support this family. And that's actually how he got his nickname, which is he decided the job was carrying bags from the train station, and he constructed this big long stick, and he figured he could carry 10 bags, and so all the kids, to make fun of him, called him Walking Satchel Tree, and Satchel being a brilliant man and child, he knew a good nickname when he heard it. He adopted that. But at age 12, he's caught in downtown Mobile stealing a handful of brass rings from the general store. His mother's brought down to the police station, and Satchel can't figure out why she's so upset. He thinks she's gonna be furious at him, but said she's just upset. And he doesn't realize that until the next day they go down to the police station and realize that he is going to be summarily, literally without any kind of due process or any hearing, anything, just sentenced to literally a concentration camp from the age 12 to 18, a place called the Negro, Home for Negro Lawbreakers up a long way up in Montgomery. And literally he's incarcerated from the time he's 12 to 18. You talk about adversity. He then has the luck, he determines when he's incarcerated. that he is going to become a great pitcher. And he actually hones his skills. And what makes him so original is he actually figured out, I'm convinced, he had some coaching and helping, but he figured a lot of this stuff out on his own. And that's what also made him so unique. He obviously had athletic talent, but athletic talent alone doesn't do it. He had a brilliant mind plus athletic talent, and he understood what worked in every angle possible, very much like Willie Mays in that sense. And he was lucky enough. There was a man in his hometown of Mobile named Alex Herman. Alex Herman was a part owner and manager of a team, Negro League team called the Chattanooga White Sox, and he saw Satchel's talent and he signed him up. And kind of one of the great ironies of history, he actually turns out to be the father of Alexis Herman, who you probably know was Bill Clinton's labor secretary.
Yes.
Satchel then comes on the scene, and the thing that's remarkable about Satchel, I went back and read, kind of pulled every game and box score and story about his first games. He shines through as a superstar, as a marvel from his very first game. People have never seen anything like him. And he continues that way through his entire career.
Yeah, from the time he shows up as a kid until he's almost 50 years old, he's unstoppable. He's just in a league on his own against everyone else. And the gosh, what was I? Now I got myself sidetracked.
Okay.
I'll get one of my questions off here, and then so in the end, all these other players come down, and they end up having to go back. They do the Trujillo team wins, and
yes,
and no Americans got shot, and they ended up going back. We have a few minutes to talk about after the story.
Sure.
What happened to the American players when they got back? Because they ended up with some controversy for having bolted and taken the money. Josh Gibson.
Yep. Well, Josh Gibson actually had the most mellow in and out in the whole series. He was playing for the Homestead Grays at the time. He had a wonderful owner named Posey. And Posey, actually, this is probably one of the magnanimous things I've ever heard of an owner doing. Satchel is sending telegram after telegram to him saying, we'll offer you huge amounts of money. And Josh says, I'm not going to just leave my team. I have to talk to my owner. And he goes and he talks to Posey and he says, here's my offers. And Posey says, look, I have to be honest with you. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. I can't pay you anything like this. I need to let you go. I can't saddle you here for a fraction of this money. And Gibson goes down there and plays. But he comes right back to his home team.
Okay.
Homestead Grays. Now the rest of the people that had been banned, and they had been, the commissioner banned them for life and all this crazy stuff. And so what was Satchel? Satchel, being the brilliant man he was, so they're sitting there and they got these great cool uniforms, right? That Trujillo's given them. They're all, and they come back, and what do? He's like, he takes the whole team and they're like, they start barnstorming America as the Trujillo All-Stars. And the funniest thing is, so they win the
dust jacket wearing his Trujillo All-Stars uniform.
And that's probably somewhere in America, I think. And they play all the way across the Midwest. As a matter of fact, they win the Denver Post tournament, which in the days before TV was a huge thing. It was known as the Second World Series. Then they start, and it's funny to read the accounts in all these Midwestern newspapers. A lot of them actually report that President Trujillo's team is coming to town. They have no idea that they just, essentially just kept on using the uniforms because they were free. Why make new? And they play all the way through the fall into New York, and they end their season playing in Yankee Stadium.
And then certainly Satchel has a long career, and I don't think any of the other players ended up being permanently out of the game.
No, they realized that all the threats were, Satchel knew they were nonsense because the league couldn't survive without
their best players. The other thing that happens, of course, is this in the Dominican Republic, this whole tournament and the election seems like a bit of a farce and a bit of fun. But by the time the election is over, Trujillo is ready to show his true face. And I'm pretty sure most Americans are not familiar with the phrase Haitian genocide, but that certainly was a marked event in the life of this dictator, Trujillo. If you can quickly just
Sure.
say,
What the irony of ironies is this tournament is played for the re-election of Trujillo. He actually ends up not being able to run for re-election. Instead, he installs a puppet, which he controls, of course, who he controls. But because he gets in a border dispute and orders the massacre of 20,000 Haitians.
Haitian laborers.
And he doesn't. No, they actually even all over the Dominican Republic, and he doesn't think he's going to get caught. Yet he gets exposed by the New York Times, and it turned out not to be fake news, and it actually ends up on the desk of Roosevelt, and it becomes an international crisis. And Trujillo figures out that he needs to hide out for like 4 years, and so he's still controlling the whole thing, but he literally ends up putting a puppet up in his place.
So it's not simply farce. It does lead into this horrible massacre of at least 20,000 Haitians, and then which has the international fallout. Hey, we don't have that much time left, but we can steal a little bit more.
Sure.
Because you brought some really cool stuff that I wanted to look at. The first one, if I may.
Yes, of course.
The first book I want to look at is, I want to tell a very short story about the author of this book. The author of this book is Lloyd Lewis. Lloyd Lewis is one of the great Civil War authors.
He is.
And very quickly, back around the same time, 1938 or so, the founder of this shop, Ralph Newman, had a general secondhand shop called Home of Books, and it was down in the Loop. And just about every day, Lloyd Lewis and his friend Carl Sandburg would come into Newman's shop to spend the afternoon talking about Abraham Lincoln and history and the Civil War, and presumably, 3 or 4 martinis later, if they wanted to go back to the Daily News, they did. But here you brought another one of Lewis's great.
I did.
He's one of the great writers of that age.
He was of that age, and
a journalist,
he was a journalist, and he wrote this kind of catch-all book about interesting stories of the time. And what's remarkable about this book is that it's really the only place I found that really allowed Satchel to explain what made him so brilliant as a pitcher, like what was behind it all, and how did he really do it. And it's all laid out there, and in only the way that really a journalistic genius like Lloyd Lewis could do.
Another thing that you managed, I love the fact that you wrote the book, but you're also the kind of scholar that wants to get the thing.
True.
You probably could have found this online, I don't know. But here's a wonderful 2-bit baseball book in wonderful condition for a pamphlet at its time. Go ahead and tell us about, and it's got one of the,
well, this was
Satchel Paige's own story.
It was self-published.
Self-published, okay.
More or less. Well, it's got and it was in 1948, and the guy who wrote it with him, Hal Leibowitz, was like the beat writer for the Cleveland team, Cleveland Indians. And Satchel obviously met him and charmed him, and he said, "Hey, let's do this book." And so they did this book, and one of the wonderful things about this book is you will see in it, they probably got the writer of the, find this very quickly, they probably got the writer of the, or the cartoonist from their paper to draw cartoons. And in it, you'll see a cartoon here of him being threatened with guns during the Trujillo series.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
So that's just a wonderful.
And then finally, Satch wrote himself an autobiography.
He did.
Which is one of the really great autobiographies of a ball player.
I truly believe that if he wasn't a sports figure, that this would be known as one of the really wonderful books.
What's it called?
It's called Maybe I'll Pitch Forever.
Maybe I'll Pitch Forever.
And it's almost like a last century's version, but real life version of Huckleberry Finn. It's all true.
Yeah.
And you'll see also in the inside the book, I have a picture of the Trujillo.
Not the Washington Monument.
monument, which was his quarter-size monument that he built and dedicated to himself, but which is a central geographic place in the book. I'll come back to it again and again and again. It's the place where the assassins start from. It's the place where he dedicates the country after the hurricane and right at the very beginning of the baseball season.
And then it has been an inspiring story, co-opted now, where it is become a monument to
The Mirabal sisters.
Yeah, the Mirabal sisters who fought against oppression.
Who Trujillo assassinated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a great story. There's so many of these great stories. You mentioned I wish we could dig deep into the sources and stuff like that. I can tell you love talking about your primary sources. But I mean, in your acknowledgments, you mentioned that there's a very robust scholarship of Dominican baseball going on right now, and you recommend some other authors that are written some great things about I'm sure people are working on Cuba. I'm sure people are working on all these other places. So a person who's a enthusiast for baseball history, of course, you're going to need Pitcher and the Dictator. But there's also a robust genre of people writing today.
But I'll tell you, unfortunately, it's largely unexplored. And the Dominican baseball history, everything that's written, there have been some in English, but honestly, a lot of the best stuff is all still in Spanish. And it's published by the gentleman who runs one of the largest papers down there, and it's actually kind of published in pamphlet form. And he's trying to put out, I think it's 40 volumes, and he's gotten to, I think, volume 15. And Martin de Ego, if you want to read about him, there's only one book in Spanish published by the Ministry of Sports in Cuba.
Right.
That's it.
So saying it's robust is not saying that Americans have access to it.
No. It's robust if you
people
can.
that only speak English and Americans
Correct.
have access to it. But really great stuff has been written. And then before we close out, I have some things. But before we close out, you also have a day job.
I do.
Your day job is in politics. You consult in politics, and you've worked on a number of campaigns. And right now, one of the people you've worked with, Senator Kamala Harris of California, is taking center stage many days at these hearings for the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, and many people thinking, including the host of this show, we're watching someone very brilliantly speaking truth to power at a crucial time in our history. So, having run that campaign, you know Senator Harris pretty well, I would say. Do you think Senator Harris would make a good president of the United States?
She'd make a great president, but you said it more eloquently than I could.
Okay.
She does. I think her genius is that she does speak truth to power, and she's one of these people who has been underestimated her whole career. She was told, for instance, she could never be elected Attorney General because how could you possibly elect a woman who was an African American from San Francisco to be the top cop of a state? And she did it. She persevered. Just a remarkable person with a brilliant mind and a great vision and more than anything, and this is all too often lacking, I think, in a lot of our politics, just really deeply held values and that she's true to.
And I certainly agree with that, and I think what we're seeing right now in these hearings is a compelling voice. And if some smart political consultant wants to find a way to share that voice with the country, I myself think that that would be a very strong candidacy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. I have some, before we wrap up, we've gone long, but you know what? There's no show after this one, so there's nobody waiting in the wings. But I need to do some housekeeping. First, I want to tell you what's coming up on Author's Voice. Our next show is A House Divided, our Civil War show, and author John Hulskamp will be here, and he and I are going to talk about his new novel, a new historical novel of the Civil War called Friends of the Wigwam. And that'll be on Thursday, September 20th at 3 p.m. Come and see John on that day. He's a great person to meet. You're going to really enjoy his book. Stranger Than Fiction, this show, our nonfiction show, then returns on Tuesday, September 25th. We'll have author and New Yorker cartoonist Ken Krimstein to tell us about his new graphic novel, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt. And join us at 3 o'clock for that on September 25th. You're going to see this video either on our Facebook feed or on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments, put them right in the questions or comments. Keep them nice, or else we're going to block you. If you are watching this on YouTube after the program, we're going to still have signed first editions of The Pitcher and the Dictator that you can buy and that we will send to you. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this show. Thank you, Ace Smith, for sharing this incredible story with us. And thank you at home for sharing about 40 minutes of your afternoon with us. Come on back soon to Author's Voice.